Scientific advancement in and of itself is a great thing. We have cured plagues that used to ravage our species with horrific regularity. We have landed on other celestial bodies, and not just with the machines, but with our own physical bodies, which, by the way, if you think we haven't landed on the moon, I regret to inform you that you're a giant nerd. We have increased our lifespans by quite a bit, as well as the quality of life, as long as you aren't eating Big Macs every day. Science has benefited us quite well and stems from a deep-seated curious nature that humans intrinsically have. We have always wanted to know what's going on. We want to explore and understand the very fabric of our being, down to the protons and neutrons and electrons, and even further past that being quarks, and then on to string theory. All of it. This abstract thinking has made our species absolutely dominate the planet we currently reside on, and hopefully one day, if we don't blow ourselves up in the future, we will be able to extend to the solar system and then to the galaxy. If we are able to get out of these toddler years for our species without detonating nukes every 3 feet, the future looks rather bright, and hopefully not bright from nuclear blasts. Intelligence, curiosity, compassion for our fellow man, and hope are something that exists within all of us in some capacity or another. But there is another side to humanity. With all light comes darkness. Our species tends to have a rather sadistic side. It's not all donating to charities and kissing babies. It's a type of barbarism that, whether we like it or not, no matter how intelligent or lacking in that department you are, we, at the end of the day, are still animals. Anger, fear, pride, arrogance, and self-serving characteristics mar the Homo sapiens race. Unlike other animals who are just trying to survive, so there really is no right or wrong for them, only survival, that kind of makes them innocent to virtually anything that they have to do in order to keep on living. But with humans, it's different. The understanding of a choice and all that follows are decisions to be made with moral implications. If a man chooses to sacrifice himself for others, while gone, they are seen as heroic in having made a tough choice, but choosing correctly. If a man saves themselves over anyone else, it may have been a tough choice, but the same idea still applies, just reversed. They are despised. There are two aspects of humanity typically that conflict with one another on a near constant basis in one way or another, whether it be external factors or internal. It's all the same because it all exists within every one of us. The duality of man, so to speak. It just depends on which moral creed you tend to subscribe to and how you see this life and if you believe there is a next. Me personally, having kind of a lawful good personality, all you nerds believing in chaotic evil can get dunked on, you freaking heathens, paladin for life. Continuing on with the pseudo-intellectual rant, these conflicting ideas can infiltrate every facet of our lives and thinking regardless of who you are. How do you get money? Do you work hard for it, or do you rob a bank? How do you get food? Do you wait in line and pay, or do you just slip it into your coat pocket and walk out? How do you obtain Adam? Do you create a machine to do it, or do you literally implant a slug into little sisters that kind of then takes a needle that needs to be stuck into other people to get it out so that you can reclaim Adam? And even then, it was an issue to begin with because the instabilities and addiction levels weren't really known, and then you just created plasmas that did it. See, there's always a choice. Oh, which by the way, I have to say younglings and little sisters and all that, because in my Roanoke Tales video over the missing 411, I mentioned what we actually call young humans, and the comments got auto-disabled, because why not, I suppose, and they haven't even been turned back on yet. Big cringe, bro. Anyhow, human morality can kind of seep into every piece of life and affect every decision you make. When the morality that aligns with what is considered good, this kind of results in things like inventions that do not harm but only seek to help. But the irony of this is, ethics will limit science by quite a bit. The horrible nature of science itself is something that not a lot of people tend to talk about, and that is the fact that the worst things have created the most knowledge. It shouldn't be lost on anyone that quite possibly the worst activity humans engage in, which is war, creates the most advances in science, whether it be technological in nature or, even worse, medical. There is an argument that morality in war does not exist, and to a degree, that's correct. So then by association, the science that comes out of war shouldn't have to be morally obligated to follow a certain code either, right? Well, that's where I disagree, but that's my own morals being applied to it. And for others, they may disagree with me. It's the concept of, at least to me, the ends do not justify the means 100% of the time, more so if it results in suffering or loss of control of life or those things that are being tested on. But for others, the ends are all that matters. How they get there matters very little, if not at all. In Bioshock, there exists a scientist known as Suchong. During the events of World War II, he would reside in Korea. Around this time, it was really a multi-war front with several fronts taking place. Europe, Asia, Africa, all the islands in the South Pacific, which are still a part of Asia, but it's far branching. Essentially, fighting was taking place in some form or fashion across the entire planet, except on the Western Hemisphere, because the United States had that on lock. Now we got freaking balloons over our head and stuff getting blown out of the sky off the west coast of Africa and over Lake Huron that are octagons. Hopefully that's not gonna result in any more Suchongs, but moving on. Korea at this point in time was incredibly unstable due to the Japanese taking over China, as well as Korea and many other island nations in the area. Under their ruling, some pretty horrific things would have happened, but the point is, Suchong was existing in this tumultuous area where survival was not assured, and this could result in some pretty profound impacts on your views of the world. You see, when you're forced to simply stay alive by any means necessary, you can kind of think of it like an expanding effect on your willingness to do horrible things. You start as a circle in the middle. On the outside of the circle exist things like sketch experiments, selling out people around you, and viewing others' lives as expendable. As you are trying to survive, depending on your moral code, this allows that circle to expand, encompassing those things you once assumed to be things that you would never do. Eventually, when you are no longer in survival mode, those things that you have expanded to are still available to you. Suchong, being a scientist, having done some terrible things to survive, would have these moral failings extend to the science that he conducted. Which, again, as I mentioned earlier, this leads to what some assume to be bad science, myself included, but it's undeniable that it does lead to some results that could help down the line. So the question you have to understand here is, when it comes to morals and science, is it better to hurt some people now and save millions later, or save some people now and possibly that's going to come at the expense of millions down the road? And there's even a third option, which is you hurt people now and it does absolutely nothing. The real life example of this type of science is the information that was actually obtained concerning medical practices and what the human body was capable of, and this was around Dr. Mengele's research in World War II. Absolutely horrific experiments, but the medical data gleaned from it was invaluable and increased our species' overall understanding of human anatomy and capabilities. As you can see, there's a whole lot of gray area existing between the light and dark areas of science, and everyone has to draw their own conclusions as to how gray they are willing to go with it. But typically, the darker the science goes, the more information that can be obtained. Which is kind of messed up, isn't it? But back to Suchong. Suchong is a perfect example of what happens when morality is thrown to the side completely and science is approached with the concept of, I just need to know how this works, I don't care what happens to the test subjects or how it's obtained. And because of this, strides in science would start happening in leaps and bounds in Rapture that would be well beyond anything that was taking place on the surface. These projects, however, as with everything I've described, would spell the undoing of many of the poor residing in Rapture, and they were essentially entrapped by a desperate need to seek medical aid. This free clinic would serve as testing grounds where there were no gods or kings, only man, and as you may have guessed, man seems to kind of go a little haywire with a flawed view of what's right and what's wrong, typically because the background that a person has definitely influences how they approach things. So with that said, let's get into the lore and plasmid studies spearheaded by Dr. Yi Suchong. And joining me today is a fellow content creator known as TheBioshockHub. He's the Bioshock YouTube guy, and if you know how in depth I go with like Dead Space on this channel, well, that's him with Bioshock. So if that interests you, he will be joining me discussing Fink, and I will actually be discussing Suchong and the connection that they have in this collaboration. And I'll also link his video over Fink at the end of this, so go check out his channel because I know y'all like Bioshock on this channel, so you will definitely enjoy his content as well. Before jumping into it though, I appreciate the support as usual over on Roanoke Tales. I should have something out this week as well, continuing our deep dive into like real world weird stuff happening all over out there, so I'll link that video also at the end of this one. But alright, let's get back into Suchong, which sounds pretty messed up. Papa Suchong, Uncle Suchong, horrific scientist extraordinaire, whatever you choose to call him, I think we can all agree he deserves a sack tap. But some of you may be confused as to why he treaded down such a dark path when it comes to his experiments, and why he chose to engage in any of this, and why life and limb appear to be valued so little concerning his views on other. But concerning his own limbs and life and everything else, nothing could be more important. Well, his history definitely shed some light on his more sadistic views that he would take with his experiments, and this all began in Korea during World War II. We are pretty much caught up so far with like the Japanese invading, but Suchong would actually be a house servant in Korea prior to the invasion by the Japanese. As the world destabilized and descended into a massive conflict, most people in one way or another were in some way affected by the fighting or occupation in or around their lands. Suchong was no different. However, upon seeing this upheaval, he would see this as an opportunity rather than a detriment to his future. He would begin to grow a certain plant that would, be put on poppy seed bagels. I would like to say what it actually is, but even mentioning younglings got my comments turned off on Roanoke Tales in my Dead Space video, even after getting manually reviewed. Got age hit like 2 days later, still hasn't been corrected, so there's really no telling what sets the bots off at this point. Maybe I'll just play like that happy, happy, happy song over the whole thing and use bright colors, because apparently that's what you have to do now. Unhinged complaining to the side, Suchong would take advantage of this conflict area because he was pretty much always highly intelligent, but it would begin to show his moral alignment. He would begin selling poppy seed bagels to the Japanese, who in turn would fund his experiments. In fact, because of this connection to the poppy seeds, he would be the only man who was spared in his city by the Japanese, as they all wanted to keep him around. Now, apart from this, his past was virtually shrouded in mystery, as well as what we truly know is that he's intelligent, but he does not care about anything other than results. He's also self-driven and worked with the Japanese in order to survive, but really benefited more than anything else. Of course, there was a country around this time that was absolutely not benefiting during this time frame, and that was the Chinese to the north. Arguably, what they were experiencing at the hands of the Japanese at this point, without getting too much into it because I'm not a historian, I'm a scientist, it was pretty bad. Because of this, at the conclusion of the war, the Chinese would likely begin the process of hunting down anyone who actively worked with the Japanese during this war, because they were pretty upset about what happened. And again, it's probably rightfully so. We had to split an atom twice just to get this thing to stop. So, if you're interested in hearing about how it all went down, I definitely give it a Google search. It's pretty horrific. Anyhow, this would have activated the almonds of Suchong, as likely anywhere on the surface that he would have tried to go, he wouldn't have been safe. So in December of 1946, he would disappear off the face of the planet, now sort of anyways, to avoid the Chinese government from hunting him down and taking him out for cooperating with the enemy during World War II. Heading down to Rapture to make a go of it in a society completely unshackled by any type of oversight, well, supposedly anyways, he would set up an independent research firm known as Suchong Institute and Laboratories, or Laboratories, it really doesn't matter how you say it. This firm would work closely with other companies known as Ryan Industries, which was actually Andrew Ryan's firm, the guy who started Rapture, as well as Sinclair Solutions. And for a while, everything was coming up Millhouse. That is until the money began to become more and more inconsistent, which in turn would begin hurting Suchong's progress. Now, whether he really cared about the money or not could be debated, but I would argue he cared more about the actual research than anything else. The money was just there to give him the ability to continue that research, and with it now coming in rather sporadically, this presented an issue for him. Then, in 1951, Suchong would have officially had his jimmies rustled enough that he would begin secretly working with Fontaine Futuristics in an effort to bridge the gap in the funding department. Connecting with Fontaine, well, it was like two turds in a bed rolling together into one giant turd. Each would look at the other as the horrible one, but really, they were honestly both pieces of shit. Frank Fontaine had a specific interest into genetic research of his company's plasmids, like Enrage and telekinesis. Suchong would then work alongside other researchers with at least somewhat of a moral compass known as Bridget Tenenbaum, and I say somewhat because she would be the creator of the Little Sisters. Orphan younglings were basically turned into monsters that had the physical ability to process Adam from the expired. Basically, they were implanted with slugs that created the atom, and then they would run around and then suck the atom out of everybody's body. So it's not like Tenenbaum was an angelic creature, but at least she would go on to regret her choice of creating the Little Sisters. Suchong, on the other hand, just kind of found them annoying. Suchong's specific job during this time frame was to figure out how to actually make these Little Sisters want to gather Adam from the expired. This mental conditioning would be critical to the whole process, as without it, there's no Adam, and without that, there are no plasmids, and without any plasmids, there is no funding, and without funding, well, Suchong can't just create horrible things anymore. And what sort of world would we be living in without that? That's right, a non-fun one. So let's take a moment to discuss the mental conditioning, as well as this will kind of shed some light on the process itself. It is seen through the eyes of the Little Sister that their view of Rapture is way strikingly, starkly different from reality. In their eyes, the dark, leaking world around them is encased in what almost appears to be like heaven, or like a heaven-like atmosphere. With bright rooms seeing to the outside world, flowing curtains, marble, and statues everywhere, this constant hallucination would help them not to be afraid of the reality around them. Along with this, it would also help them just completely ignore those that were splicers and disfigured running around trying to take them out. A long-term visual hallucination like this would require some pretty substantial changes to the physical structuring of the brain, leading to some things like activations in some areas and depressed effects in others. For complex hallucinations, ideas have been raised that show it could be changes in brain structure to biochemical imbalances which disturbs the neurotransmitters to even an emergence of the unconscious into the conscious, but potentially for the long-lasting and persistent hallucinations brought to the Little Sisters, this process likely involves all three. A disturbance such as an irritation, which would be basically a seizure, takes place in the cortical centers which are responsible for visual processing. It must be known that this seizure in the primary visual cortex, known as Brodmann's Area 17, would cause more simple hallucinations, whereas the cortices of Brodmann's Areas 18 and 19 cause complex hallucinations. So what does that mean? Depending on where a seizure takes place, the types of hallucinations would be more pronounced and all-encompassing. But to understand that, we have to know that a seizure is simply hyperactivity in the brain. When too many neurons are firing at once and seemingly chaotically, this can cause the seizure that we have seen. However, not all seizures result in the spasming and jerking that are typically associated with it. In some cases, a visual seizure can result in things like blurred vision, loss of focus, seeing colored dots, and in some cases, the brief hallucination of seeing unfamiliar faces or even scenes as the environment around you changes. And that's the point I want to focus on. I believe Suchong, during this process, considering he was playing with the genetics of people like people play with Legos, that would cause genetic variances, or he would cause genetic variances, in the neuronal firing patterns of the visual cortex. The purpose of this would be, at first and foremost, to change the visual perception experienced by the Little Sisters. As time would go on, however, it would become apparent that changing their perception didn't mean that they just wanted to run around and collect this atom. After all, they were younger, and what do young people do? Typically the exact opposite of actually wanting to work. He would begin the mental conditioning process, which would ultimately compel them to do as he asked. If Jack is anything to go off of, then when he's told by Suchong to, "Would you kindly sever the cervical spine of a puppy?" despite Jack not wanting to, he was compelled to. This concept will then fall back on the idea known as psychological resilience. Psychological resilience is something that, if my wife was on the channel, having a master's in clinical mental health, and likely heading towards her PhD sometime soon, she could probably explain this rather well. I mean, it's actually sort of funny. So I believe there's like a physical foundation for most of humanity's psychological being, because I'm a biologist, whereas she's in the psychology field, and she believes our psychological being has a lot to do with the environment and how we were kind of treated as pre-adults, rather than biological foundations. Our marriage is a literal physical expression of nature versus nurture. Regardless, though, I will have to concede that when it comes to mental conditioning, this is unfortunately a nurture event, but it still has actual nature roots. So to break down the psychological resilience, the process has been linked back to environmental and caregiving conditions during childhood, and if the childhood is loving, emotionally responsive, consistent, reliable, who wants that? Then the odds of you having a psychologically resilient adult are quite good. Now, there's obviously genetic factors that can influence this, such as mental illness, but barring anything like that, the chances of having a functional adult who can deal with the world, if they have a good childhood, well, I mean, those chances are pretty good. Suchong is none of those things. Despite being called Papa Suchong and Uncle Suchong, he never really cared for any of the Little Sisters, and was considered borderline, if not full-on confrontational, leading to physical alterations with those who were a quarter his size and had no means of combating the threat. As scholars maintain, basically no balls behavior. This lack of psychological foundation in which to reside on and the conditioning brought on by Suchong would over time cause the Little Sisters to be compelled to gather the atom necessary because it's all they knew. Really, no genetic tampering, or supposedly no genetic tampering, would be required of them to comply with Suchong. That said, that is our understanding of mental resilience. Now, for the actual Chad science involved, known as neurology, those who possess more mental fortitude, so to speak, have higher levels of activity seen in the left prefrontal cortex, which is known for its role in emotional responses, mood regulation, and meaning making. This area of the brain, should Suchong have altered it in some ways, leading to a depression of activity in this area, would have made the Little Sisters more susceptible to his suggestions and completion of his commands. This could have been easily accomplished by utilizing the same methods associated with changing the visual cortex. How is this possible? Well, it's actually somewhat easy if you mess with the genetics. By increasing the amount of receptors for a neurotransmitter, you can actually induce a form of depression in this area. Now, you don't want it to happen all over the brain, but just in this specific portion of the brain, which may suggest a localized genetic manipulation event happened here. To clarify, here's how it happens. By increasing the amount of receptors, if there is not enough chemicals present to attach to those receptors, then the next neuron will not be activated, meaning that the brain is in a depressed state. This adaptation is seen in the brain when it's kind of influenced by its environment. Take coffee, for instance. Caffeine will enter an adenosine receptor, which increases wakefulness by blocking the antagonist against the receptor. It also may be possible that, genetically speaking, certain receptors were done away with so that the neurons never fire, or it's even possible that the body automatically releases something else that binds to those receptors that blocks the initial neurotransmitter from getting to where it needs to go. Basically, the little sisters are affected in the frontal cortex, so that's kind of what makes them more susceptible to the suggestions of Suchong to go and get the atom. This process reached its culmination concerning the conditioning with specifically someone like Jack. We mentioned the puppy incident already, but this project was known as Ace in the Hole. The same method used on the little sisters was applied to Jack as he was rapidly aged and made incredibly susceptible to the "would you kindly" phrase as well as Code Yellow. Would you kindly forced him to be compelled to do whatever he was asked to do, which was in the prefrontal cortex, but Code Yellow would physically cause his body to stop his heart. This in turn almost was the end of Jack. But this implanting of ideas and being mind controlled would go on to scare Frank Fontaine so much that as a result, he would order Suchong to create something known as Lot 192. Lot 192 is a biological modification that seems to have some pretty profound impacts on the human genome on a macro scale. It appears as though every cell in the body would be affected by this substance, which counteracts the effects of the mind control plasmid. I would have to assume that the mind control plasmid gives you the ability to decrease activation of neurons in the prefrontal cortex, allowing for anyone to become extremely open to suggestions from others. Lot 192 would stop this effect, allowing for a person to maintain their own ideas and wants, which would suggest normal firing patterns in the brain, perhaps providing a genetic roadmap towards normal receptor creation despite outside influence. Jack was able to consume Lot 192 to stop him from being influenced by the phrase "would you kindly." However, Code Yellow seems to have been a more entrenched mental hold as it had physical effects on his heart. This would seem to suggest that this was in his very brainstem. Because the first dose was sort of working, it can be assumed that it's not a very potent chemical and instead is reliant on quantity instead of quality. By ingesting the first dose, it would spread throughout his body in a seemingly random pattern, which in turn would affect all his plasmids, causing him to cycle through those as they became destabilized by the presence of some of the Lot 192. By the time he drank the second, it seems the Lot 192 had finally made its way through his body, deactivating the neuronal alterations caused by the conditioning and genetic manipulation, which in turn gave him full control over his body once again, allowing for his heart to keep beating. It's still rather interesting how an auditory phrase could have activated the plasmid within his brainstem, but the process, I imagine, would cause more and more receptors to begin forming, eventually leading to the brainstem to no longer properly send the electrical signals to the heart to keep beating. The heart does have kind of like a pacemaker on its own process, which is why you can kind of snap your neck and still survive, but without the influence of the brainstem, you can quickly go into fibrillation of your heart and then it will stop. For this entire process to even take place, with the atom collection, the Lot 192, the thriving business, and research in general, this would require some pretty nefarious dealings that for a lot of people would spell their undoing, at least in their natural human life. See, in Rapture, around this time, unchecked monopolies and no rules meant that some pretty horrendous things could take place, and it was just accepted that if you didn't make it to the top, you were basically screwed. But that's sort of the issue with pure capitalism. And I'm like as pro-capitalist as they come, but too much of a good thing results in bad things springing up. Only a few would rise to the top, and those that didn't were subjected to hardships and horrible ethic violations as a result. Those that were too poor to get medical help would go to Suchong's free clinic for medical aid. I mean, it seems like a pretty good idea. If someone's offering free doctor support, then surely that's a good thing. Well, much like a free website online, if you're not paying for it and you're getting something for free that you probably need to stop doing because it destroys your brain, then that means typically you're the product. The same is said for this medical clinic. Experiments would be conducted on people that came in with youngins, turned into little sisters, whereas the adults, specifically males, would be turned into big daddies, and women would then later on be turned into big sisters. As the people poured in for help, Suchong would begin to realize that little sisters, while atom collecting, would need to be protected, because even though they were physically more resilient than unaltered peers, they still only had the same strength as their peers. So an idea was hatched. Build a protector that would take out anyone who got close or begin an attack. And this would be critical because the civil war that was currently erupting within Rapture meant that more people would need plasmids to defend themselves, which in turn meant more people needed atom, which meant more people got addicted, which meant that they needed more atom. Business at this point was booming because of this feedback loop, and Suchong needed to have his assets protected. Around 1958, Frank Fontaine would go on to fake his in, and Fontaine Futuristics would be nationalized by the Rapture Central Council. Around this time, Suchong would be playing hard to get, but after Andrew threatened to lock him in there with the rebels and Fontaine's department stores, Suchong, being self-serving as ever, would agree to work with Andrew and continue the process of developing the Little Sisters and Big Daddies. This civil war, however, had alarmed Andrew Ryan as something needed to be done about the plasmids that everyone had. Suchong would then suggest that they put a pheromone system into the plasmids in order to control the genetically modified customers. This seemed to be a great idea, and so it was done. These pheromones would be put into the plasmids so that Ryan could maintain control over anyone that might come along, which worked for a while. But this same pheromone substance was also found in the Little Sisters in order to complete their tasks of obtaining Adam from the fallen customers. So the next question on the list is, how exactly do pheromones work on humans? Well, the short answer is that they don't, at least as far as we can tell. But in other ways, they may also work. It's sort of a strange situation, but it may work more so in the sense of smell more than anything. Within animals, there is an operation on pheromone signaling that does exist, and even within humans, actually, there does exist an organ that sits in the anterior-inferior portion of the nasal septum known as the vomeronasal organ, or VNO for short. This organ in animals who respond to pheromones will take in a scent, which then enters this organ and gives information about the other animal, like if they're sick or old, or if they're full of testosterone or estrogen, are ready to breed. All that can be contained because pheromones exist sort of like an informational sheet to what's going on in the body of another animal. And this is incredibly important because they can't talk. So because they can't talk, it's hard to tell when another animal like that is ready to get frisky. These pheromones will inspire unconscious and automated actions within the smelling animal, like switching them on and making them ready to breed, or causing that animal to avoid the other if they're sick. It's a great way to achieve this information and then subsequent action. Humans also have the VNO, but as far as we can tell, there's no access to any accessory olfactory bulbs like in other animals, and as a result, while pheromones may be going into this organ, no information is ever gleaned from it, which means technically humans do produce pheromones, it's just no other human is responding to it. So because of this, it is considered non-operational, and we see this in numerous pheromone tests that have been done trying to figure out if you can prefer somebody simply because of the way they smell. It turns out you really can't. However, there is a caveat to all of this. It is well documented at this point that if someone smells a certain way to another, that could result in you becoming friends or enemies to them. It has been seen that putting people together of certain scents may cause some to become standoffish towards another, which is kind of fairly odd. Now, I'm pretty sure, like, you take a guy from BronyCon who hasn't showered in 7 weeks, like, nobody's gonna want to be his friend.
Kill it with fire!
But for regular showered people, the same effect has been seen. So this may suggest that our bodies do still somewhat genetically identify compatible people based on scent alone, but that needs to be looked into way more in depth because it's still uncertain if that's actually what it is or not. Because having worked construction, I could be friends with like every other person that was chill and we all smelled terrible. It would seem in Bioshock, however, this genetic modification that was possibly reliant on these accessory olfactory bulbs would potentially cause some of them to either form or force a connection to the standard olfactory bulb that we all have. This could be possibly rewritten into the neurons in the area to form this connection and essentially unlock a very old and ancient trait within the human meat suit. Once done, the person would be influenced in the same unconscious and automated way as animals are when they come into contact with pheromones. This would work on the customers as well as the Little Sisters to gather the atom that was needed. As Suchong continued to work under Ryan with consistent budget cuts, but still being alive, in October of 1958, he would discover a shimmer or a type of tear through the fabric of reality that led to Columbia, which was set in another universe at another time. But luckily the good old USA is still there. Not the one in the clouds, that one had issues, the one still on the ground. He became enmeshed in the idea of discovering the source of this phenomenon. He would subsequently hire people and find more of these tears, which eventually a mysterious young woman, which was known as Elizabeth, and we all know her now, was opening and closing these at will. Eventually, information would be discovered that a man named Jeremiah Fink, who was the head of Fink Manufacturing in Columbia, was opening tears into this reality and stealing Suchong's work on genetics, which were his plasmids. Which, I mean, how do you even stop that from happening? That would be really annoying. Obviously, this made Suchong rather upsetty spaghetti, as he would go on to steal Fink's design on making ingestible plasmids. And for that, we turn to our man, Bioshock Hub, to shed some insight on how that is happening.
Due to the many tears that were all around Columbia, one in particular stood out to Jeremiah Fink. This tear led to Dr. Suchong's office in Rapture. He would steal ideas and concepts from Suchong and pass them off as his own. Likewise, Suchong would also do the same thing. However, the two decided to work together eventually, and this led to a lot of experiments on both ends of the tear. The biggest thing Fink was experimenting on was the process of imprinting, like the Big Daddies did to the Little Sisters. However, all of the tests Jeremiah Fink conducted failed. Now, let's take a deeper look at the brief backstory of Jeremiah Fink as a person, shall we? For today's video, I'd like to mainly showcase the despicable acts that Jeremiah Fink committed during the events of Bioshock Infinite. Fink first noticed the tears due to his brother, Albert, who stole music from them and passed it off as his own. At first, Jeremiah thought his brother was just hearing things, until he experienced it for himself. Eventually, a wonderful opportunity presented itself when one of these tears led to Rapture, and more specifically, Dr. Yi Suchong. Jeremiah figured that since his brother was able to obtain wealth by utilizing these tears, why couldn't he? Now that you're filled in on the backstory between these two, let's get into Fink's actions. Now, with the aid of Suchong, Fink wanted to replicate the Big Daddies and Little Sisters, which eventually led to the construction of Songbird. While leading up to the successful imprinting process between Songbird and Elizabeth, multiple experiments failed. There were various tests done on humans as well as animals. Like Suchong, Jeremiah Fink didn't have a moral compass when it came to making a profit. Another example of his lack of empathy is the handyman. Fink would usually take sick individuals who were seeking medical treatment or people who were chosen to become a handyman, essentially mimicking the Protector program. He had no issues with this, because either way, he would make a profit whether the individual lived as a handyman or died during the procedure. When these imprinting experiments failed with the animals, Fink and his researchers would just leave the animals to die. Another instance to discuss is how Jeremiah Fink treats his employees at Fink Manufacturing. Essentially, it's just slave labor. These employees would be paid only with tokens that'll have value at Fink Manufacturing. So these people bust their asses for little to no return. Also, the living quarters for most of these employees are horrid to say the least. They live in Shantytown, which has nothing but sick, hungry, and exhausted people and families. Eventually, along with other events, this led to the Vox Revolution, in which Jeremiah Fink would be executed by Daisy Fitzroy. Finally, I just wanted to say thank you, Roanoke, for allowing me to help you with this video. If you guys would like to hear more about Jeremiah Fink and his actions, my video will be down in the description.
Did you enjoy his breakdown? I hope you did. But as you can see, the plasmids in Rapture involved you stabbing your arm and were rather painful, whereas Fink made his vigors, as he would call them, utilizing an oxidizing agent that allowed them to be ingested, which was much more agreeable than just walking around injecting yourself. Interestingly, it also seems like it had way less detrimental effects on the person as well. After jacking this information, Suchong would present it to Ryan, which gave Suchong a two-way street to steal more of Fink's inventions like gear. After stealing from one another for long enough, it became apparent that really, they could just do this because of the separation of their universes, so it really didn't matter. Like two little separate kingdoms blocked off from one another by a massive sea. They began to communicate with each other, and they eventually pooled their resources on several different scientific collaborations. This was accomplished by passing along the plans for the Big Daddy to Fink, who in turn would go on to make his own variations, such as the Handyman and Columbia, who sport sort of like a lot of similarities to Big Daddies, with elongated arms and likely mostly mechanical in nature, as well as in large legs to support them. We may have to do a video on him at some point, but essentially the man and machine fused together. But nothing was more horrifying than Fink's other invention, the Songbird. Much like the Big Daddy, the Songbird is a combination between a machine and a human. At first, multiple experiments were done with animals such as gorillas and dogs to create a successful psychological pair bond with Elizabeth. In the end, a crude prototype was assembled, connected to a breather. Attempts to psychologically indoctrinate the prototype were not successful. so Fink left it abandoned in his old factory. In the end, the bond between Songbird and Elizabeth was established by a freak accident. Songbird escaped through the laboratory and accidentally crashed into Elizabeth's tower, forcing Elizabeth to repair its breather. This created a successful pair bond between the creature and Elizabeth, and it would protect her fiercely. On the other hand, Suchong earnestly believed that DNA, in particular a hair sample, was the cause of the pair bond and attempted multiple times to figure out how to replicate the Songbird's pair bond with his own Big Daddy's. Songbird's mechanical features are similar to that of a Big Daddy, with color-changing eyes to indicate its mood, green eyes indicate friendliness towards a person or object of focus, namely Elizabeth. Orange eyes indicate awareness but indifference to Songbird's surroundings, and red represents heavy hostility, chiefly towards Booker. Songbird's only weapons are the metal talons mounted on its feet and knuckles, but its immense size, strength, and speed allows it to effortlessly obliterate people, vehicles, and even structures. After some time, after all this, Suchong would finally meet his own end due to this horrible lack of morality and understanding of what was going on in his own experiments at that point in time. The whole time, Suchong knew that the Little Sisters needed to protect her because they could still be overpowered by splicers in the area. Making the Little Sisters also was no easy feat, so their survival, until it was the right time to harvest them, was paramount to his success. So, he would continue to make Big Daddies, but needed to figure out how to have them imprint on one another, because it seemed like the Little Sisters did not like the Big Daddies, and the Big Daddies did not care for the Little Sisters. This imprinting process would continue to frustrate him more and more, because their pheromone application should have worked, but it didn't seem to be doing the job as needed. So, we now know that it would take 3 applications of this pheromone for the imprinting to take hold, and as he was attempting to get a Big Daddy to imprint, a Little Sister would come up to him asking him questions, to which he would strike and curse at her because she was apparently being annoying. Papa Suchong, more like Papa Douchong. Yes, that phrase alone will result in the destruction of this channel. Once he did this, unbeknownst to him, it was all over. This would rustle the jimmies of the Big Daddy just enough, who had officially imprinted on the Little Sister, with the mental conditioning and pheromone signatures all falling into place. The Big Daddy would then turn on Suchong as he tried to flee, but the Big Daddy put the drill through his back, severing his spine quite easily before making its way into his heart and lungs, turning those into literal mincemeat. Within a few seconds, it was all over and Suchong's body was utterly destroyed. The Little Sister and Big Daddy would then walk away from the destruction and continue gathering at him as Rapture descended into further chaos, and the story of Suchong comes to an end. After a lifetime of immorality, unethical behavior, and scientific advancements, Suchong would ultimately be taken out by his own inability to control himself and by his own creation. Is it ironic? Maybe, but really it's likely something that took way too long to happen, and the guy was on borrowed time from literally the drop, having to uproot his life after World War II for similar decisions and opportunistic cowardice. But anyhow, I want to thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, then leaving a like would be great, and subscribing is a great way to stay up to date on when I post. I will put the Bioshock Hub's channel in the description so that you can see his part of the collaboration, and also I'll put at the end of this video. It's going to be really good. I also drop my links in the description as well, like Roanoke Tales, Twitter, Discord, Patreon, all that. And speaking of patrons, I'd like to thank mine real quick. Huge thank you to our astronaut, Wesley A. Weaver Jr. Welcome back, my guy, and again, thank you. Next, I'd like to thank our astrophysicist, Death's Dancer, as well as our scientists, Countryside Limbo, Lakune, and Logan Satomi. And to the rest of my patrons, I thank you guys as well. Your help goes a long way towards keeping everything running and is greatly appreciated. All right, so that's going to do it for me. I hope everyone enjoyed. Go check out Bioshock Hub, and I'll see y'all in the next one.